Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Japan Politics Podcast. I'm your host, Luke Whitaker. This is episode 6, and this is an episode that's largely going to be centered on the recent crisis in South Korea and sort of the responses to it. So I want to dive right in and sort of covering that, the reaction and what's happening, what's going to happen next. So I think it's worth asking, before we dive into the sort of the martial law crisis, who is this centered around? Who is President Yoon of South Korea? He's the 13th president who succeeded President Moon in 2022. Before that, he was the Prosecutor General of South Korea, and he's now, as I say, become the 13th president. He had a very incredibly close win in the election to confirm him as president of South Korea, which maybe you could argue has put him in a weak position right out of the gate. He won 48.56% of the popular vote, compared to his opponent who had 47.83%, so an incredibly narrow margin there. And since then, he's had to deal with, since an election in 2024, an assembly of 300 lawmakers in South Korea that has the majority of them are his opponents. So he's got a majority opposition assembly, which has weakened his ability to do anything, and that's led to some calling him a lame duck president ever since that happened. He's faced controversy since then. He's had falling approval. He's had difficulties, as I say, getting things done because of this opposition. And he's faced scandals, including his wife being accused of a corruption scandal. And then there's been a further scandal that he may have potentially influenced or attempted to influence the investigation into his wife, and sort of wield undue influence there. And this is not something that's is particularly new in South Korea. There's been even former prime ministers and presidents who've been accused of criminal charges. Some even have been convicted of things relating to bribery and corruption, etc., since the 1980s. So that now leads us to this current situation where Yoon was facing an incredible amount of pressure, declining popularity, and he gave this rather incredible speech where he said that he was declaring martial law in order to combat anti-government forces within South Korea. The implication possibly being that these opposing lawmakers who were getting in the way of him and sort of impeding his ability to make change, and were arguably he is calling them the anti-government forces based on the reading between the lines there. So he declared martial law, effectively taking government temporarily away from the parliament and giving it to the military. This led to an incredible deal of confusion overnight. In the end, there was a great deal of protest and resistance to this on the streets of Seoul and South Korea, and the lawmakers, a number of them actually managed to slip through to the parliament and barricaded themselves in there. 190 lawmakers were able to do so, and in the end, despite a military build-up in the area, they managed to maintain that position. They weren't driven out of parliament, and in the end, they voted against this martial law. And so due to a combination of that pressure and the public outcry, it appears this is now ending. The military stated that only the president himself, as the head of the South Korean government, could end martial law, but it appears that Yoon has given in to pressure. He's said he would assemble his cabinet, and now he's ended martial law. And now there's serious questions about what this says about the constitution of South Korea, what the reaction to this will be, whether he can remain in office. There's efforts already underway, I believe, to possibly impeach him. The difficulty of that is, although the opposition, as I've said earlier, do have the majority in South Korea's assembly, I think you need something like a 2/3 majority, which means he has enough lawmakers normally on his side to potentially block it. It just depends whether the lawmakers want to be seen as stopping that, or whether he'll stand down before it can get to that point. But this situation, I believe, is still in flux. He's still nominally in office, and he still nominally has the votes to, but if people vote on purely party political lines, to stop himself being impeached, which would create quite a crisis. He's already prior to this was described as a lame duck. There could potentially be severe pressure for him to step down if he isn't voted out. Possibly even there may well be attempts at a criminal prosecution based on this. He might be accused of having breached the constitution of South Korea. And so really just this is an incredible chaotic period, and we just have to sit and wait to see how the lawmakers vote on this, what Yoon's response to this ultimately is. But for now, it appears that martial law has been stood down based on that decree, and that for the moment, this declaration of military law is no longer current. And so that's it really. We just sort of had to wait to see where it plays out from there. This raises a number of questions. Now you might ask yourself, this is a Japan Politics podcast, what's this got to do with Japan? Well, it could be seen as impacting Japan a number of ways. Number one, there are very close historical ties between South Korea and Japan. They're near neighbours. They're both southeastern democracies, and this could have implications very much on the South Korean leadership and ties between Japan and South Korea. Just recently, Ishin was speculating about a possible Asian NATO, where South Korea were on the list of countries he was hoping to tie, or speculating he might hope to tie into sort of a close association. To say the very least, that has thrown that in flux. We don't know who the president of South Korea will be in the future, what sort of position Yoon will be if he remains. And this is at a time where there is possibly going to have to be a response to China and the sort of potential show-off between them and Trump over tariffs. You might want to have close diplomatic, economic ties to respond to that situation. There's the question of Taiwan and China's possible designs on the island, or increasing their sovereignty and control over islands and the sort of the Pacific Sea. The response to that, you would hope to have a South Korea who you could cooperate with, or at least understand who the leader was. And this is creating a great deal of uncertainty, just as there's a crisis like that. And also, it's not entirely impossible that North Korea, very unpredictable, might have some sort of response where they look to take advantage of this uncertainty or respond to it in some way. That's very unpredictable, and that also could have implications on Japan as well in a security diplomatic sense, and they might have to respond to that possibly if that were to occur. And it raises a number of questions also, as I say, the South Korea, Japan, they're both southeastern countries, democracies. People might be asking, what does this mean if this could throw chaos into one country like this? Could this happen to Japan? Which raises another question. Could potentially a situation like this happen in Japan? And I believe the simple answer to this is no, not exactly, because there's no sort of clear constitutional way to just declare martial law in Japan in the same sense. There's no... I don't believe there's a similar process that exists to the South Korean president to just declare martial law for the Prime Minister of Japan. Now, the Prime Minister of Japan is the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces. He could declare a state of emergency, or he could seek to do something with the armed forces. But I believe that's reined in by Japan's pacifist constitution that at least nominally says Japan's military... Well, it's not a military, it's purely a force for self-defense, and Japan is not to have a military for any other purpose aside from self-defense. So if you were attempting to do something similar, that raises serious, would very much look to be potentially against the constitution of Japan. That would be open to question. And this also echoes very much back to the World War II constitution, which was founded in a way to respond to a situation where sort of there was a vacuum, because prior to World War II and Japan's previous constitution, very much the Emperor of Japan was seen as sort of the head leader and sort of the focus of the constitution of Japan. He nominally was meant to have oversight over all decisions and was meant to be the sort of the final arbiter of military decisions for Japan. And now he wasn't... well, this is a historical thing that's open to debate, but some would say that he wasn't actively running the day-to-day government of Japan, and that sort of created a vacuum where people could act on his behalf and said, oh, the constitution says we have to follow the emperor, and we were doing this on his behalf. And this led to a series of incidents where people would sort of do things nominally on the emperor's behalf, and because of that vacuum, that no longer exists, because the emperor is meant to have no role whatsoever in Japanese politics. He's no longer the head of the military. And as I say, there's no set way to just declare martial law has happened in South Korea in the same way in Japan. And there's the question of Japan's pacifist constitution providing some degree of protection to prevent that happening in any sense. So no, I don't believe it could happen in exactly the same way in any sense. Now, what was Japan's response to this South Korean martial law crisis? Well, in some sense, it was sort of hard to respond because it happened so suddenly without warning and then ended so quickly that in many ways it was hard to respond at all. But Ishiba has come out and said he's concerned, he's monitoring the situation, which is all you can say really in a situation like this, and also that there's a question. I believe the Swedish head of state has already cancelled a visit to South Korea. Now, Ishiba also has a plan coming up in the next month or he did have a plan to visit the head of South Korea and have a diplomatic visit. That is now in question, to say the very least. I don't think it's been officially cancelled as yet, but we don't know if Yoon will be in office, who the leader in office will be, if this situation is still going to be in play by the time that visit comes around. So that is very much under question, to say the least. And as I say, Ishiba says he's monitoring this and watching it with grave concern, and which is about all you can say for now. And they're sort of waiting to respond. I think once the situation develops. That's also aside from obviously individuals in Japan sort of watching this with concern, and just generally being worried about it. But as I say, that's the main official response I've seen from Ishiba. I think another interesting implication of this, which also, of course, will apply to Japan, is that we're now no longer in an era where I believe one nominal effect of martial law is that you can sort of take control of state media, at least in South Korea. I believe that's how it works. But because of course, social media, people were very quickly able to spread news about this and flood to the streets. That also has implications for Japan. We've seen social media having an increasing impact in things like political campaigns, and I think it seems very trite to say it because we've been aware of this for quite some time, but it's just another demonstration of how the world has moved on and how state-controlled media is very important, yes, but social media also can very much have a key impact on political and current events. Another item moving on to sort of more national Japan politics I want to mention is that now there's a new leader of Ishin. This we talked about previously, how they perhaps had not a disastrous, but perhaps a little bit of an underwhelming election. They were sort of positioning themselves as an opposition party to the LDP and also fellow conservative party, but more reformist perhaps than the LDP. But despite the LDP's fall in popularity, an election that you would largely call a failure for them, where they lost seats, Ishin also lost seats and sort of really failed to capitalise on that situation. Now, Ishin has selected a new leader. They've selected the governor of Osaka, which makes a great deal of sense when you think about the regional popularity and sort of a key hold on Osaka that Ishin have. It's a sort of a base of support for them. And they selected the governor, Hirofumi Yoshimura, to lead the opposition party. And so that is seen as a sort of a crucial event, I think, because Ishin control, despite having a slight loss in the number of total seats, they are going to be a key opposition to LDP. It's a very tight hung parliament, and so they have a significant block of seats. So a new leader in that respect, where it doesn't necessarily mean that anything is going to immediately change, but I think it'll be interesting to see what his response is, how he plans to lead the party, what his priorities are going to be, and whether, like the DPP, he might be willing to enter discussions with the LDP, or is just going to maintain a line of pure opposition, and it's up to the LDP to work with other parties. But be very interesting to see how he begins leading his party and what their next steps are there and how they look to bounce back from not necessarily disastrous, but perhaps a non-event of an election for them where they lost a few seats. I think it's also worth covering that Ishiba's made a couple of statements on some ongoing issues in Japan relating to married and family life. One thing Ishiba, the Prime Minister of Japan, leader of the LDP, has come out and said is that he's looking at sort of the declining birth rate and family situation in Japan, and he said that he wants to stress the need to make regional places areas where young people will want to live and sort of raise families to combat population decline. This is interesting because I saw there was a sort of I can't remember the name of the place, but it was a sort of a regional town in Japan that sort of went viral because it was sort of bucking the general birth rate. And I think there are a few reasons for this. I think it was a place where families were moving to rather than necessarily just the local population just happened to have more kids. I think people were moving there because it was seen as like family friendly. There was a sort of programs to help Japanese couples having children. It was seen as a sort of a very pro-family area, and I think it was also next to a Japan military base. So I think all these things fed into couples there having more children than average. It's the small mountain town called Nagi in Japan. It's a sort of a small mountain town, which I can relate to. I grew up in a sort of small mountain area in UK. But the fertility rate there is more than twice the national average, and I believe that got some sort of press attention and sort of speculation as to how they're able to buck the national trend and what are they doing right that we can learn from. So I wonder if this statement could be in a response to that in some way. But he said we sort of have to look at that and possibly make regional places the focus of potential programs or efforts for Japan to fight their declining birth rate and sort of encourage more childbirth in Japan and combat population decline. Just so I thought that was quite interesting that he's weighing in a sort of an ongoing economic, political, social issue in Japan there. Another thing is, and relating to family life, is Ishiba has weighed in on the separate surname, which is an ongoing thing in Japan. Many political parties have different stances on this issue as to how we should treat surnames of married couples. But now he's expressed caution on the idea of allowing married couples to have separate surnames, and he says he wants to sort of weigh up public opinion, and you should sort of have an open discussion, debate about this before weighing in, which I think is, I guess, when this is something that divides political parties and he's got a minority government, not particularly surprising. I guess it's sort of a non-statement to say, oh, we have to talk about this before just weighing in with what he thinks is right or before taking the charge on this. I suppose he's sort of, you could maybe argue he's kicking the can down the road or seeing where other parties will stand on this before making any decision. But that suggests to me that there's not going to be an immediate resolution on this, which you could perhaps say of many other like non-pressing issues when there's such a difficult political situation in Japan with such a tight parliament and a minority government there. But I just thought it was interesting he weighed on those two sort of family related issues in 1 week. So I think that just about rounds up the political section of the show. There isn't any other news story I'd like to cover, which is this situation. It's a bit more light-hearted, focused on a bear in Japan, where it sort of stormed its way into a supermarket. Let me just find the details of this. Yeah, so a bear forced its way into a supermarket in Akita City. I believe it was there for something like more than a day, 2 days, I believe. And while it was there, it just sort of gorged itself on meat in the supermarket. They had to close it down, obviously, and close to the public. And I just thought the response to it was very, very Japanese, very cautious, measured. They first laid traps for the bear to try and catch it. They deployed drones, but obviously because the bear was inside, they couldn't really do anything. And also they had to sort of cordon it off and have like a sort of a police barrier around the supermarket. They obviously didn't rush in to engage with the bear to endanger people, but they just sort of had to play this waiting game, I think, in the end with the bear. And then in the end, I believe it fell into or was caught up in one of these traps, and in the end the bear was detained. They were able to safely get it out of there, but it perhaps also, as I say, by the very cautious nature and measured nature of the response maybe tells you something about Japan or the way they view the way you should respond to these sort of situations. But yeah, that ends the sort of impromptu episode of the Japan Politics Podcast, everyone. Thank you so much for listening, and sayonara, goodbye.